Hey, everybody. Thanks for joining in for another episode of the Side View podcast. This week, my introduction is a little bit different in that what I'm introducing is actually a cross posting of another event I did for the Side View over at Peter Limberg's website, organization, community, the Stoa. Now, if you listen to the side view, there's a good chance that you know who Peter is. There's also a good chance that you know, or maybe even have participated in some events at the Stoa. But if you don't, the Stoa is, I want to say it's a kind of a new formation that emerged in the early part of 2020, right around the time that those first COVID lockdowns started to hit around the world. And what the Stoa is it's very much like a live event, like a live speaker series done online, but they call it they call it like a community podcast or a group podcast. They also host other kind of more interactive events and group events where multiple people are participating, panels and dialogues. Also, some events that are more kind of exercise oriented, where um, maybe you're engaging in different types of practices, psychotechnologies, as John Vervaeke likes to say. Yeah, a more experiential sort of hands-on engagement with the subject matter being discussed rather than simply like in a normal podcast where you'd throw your headphones on and listen to two people talk and just kind of passively receive what's coming at you. The Stoa has much more of a engaging participatory quality to it, and that's part of the reason why I want to post it here. Well, there's two reasons really. The first is that what you're going to hear from me, from my talk that I gave there, was actually an interview that I did with David Collins, somebody who's also spoken at the Stoa. He's also written a few pieces for the side view here on the website. He was on my podcast last year, maybe even the year before now. Gosh, it's been a while. And he did ran us through a meditative exercise on the podcast, and we talked philosophy. He has degrees in philosophy, psychology, and experience as a meditation instructor and meditation leader and so forth. So he's drawing from a lot of areas. Anyway, when I was involved in a discussion with a few people about what could we bring to the Stoa. We're planning to do a series of discussions over there, discussions and events, topics, themes, um, and I was just kind of crowdsourcing a little bit, ideas for discussions. And in this group, we were talking. Dave said, "Hey, why don't we hear a little bit from you about why you created the side view, what's behind the side view, where it is today, and where it's going. And instead of just kind of having you talk, why don't we kind of engage in a dialogue?" So Dave actually suggested that for the first of these sessions that he would sort of interview me. We have a kind of more of a rapport than um, just a simple back and forth of, sort of question and answer would suggest. So Dave is somebody who knows the side view project. He knows a little bit about what I'm doing philosophically. I also know kind of what he's up to, what he's been doing, where his research and his writing is heading. So we have a rapport built up there. And we use that kind of to our advantage to have a dialogue about not just what is the side view. That was kind of the hook for this series that will continue on with the Stoa, but um, also to raise more general questions about what is this is what I'm kind of fascinated about right now. What is the role of these newer organizations? like the Stoa, like the Side View, like Palladium magazine. I interviewed the guys from Palladium a couple weeks ago. Um, and we're all, in different ways, with different aesthetics, with different sort of philosophical underpinnings and assumptions and attitudes and goals. But we're all trying to build new things, and I think that's one shared goal that we all have, is that we're trying to break free of some of these older molds, but not just because or I'll just speak for myself now, not just because I want to create a new journal, or because I want to create a new podcast, but I'm really interested in creating whole new media environments, So with the Side View, I come at this question of perception and the relation of practice and perception, um, not just from a multidisciplinary perspective, right? We talk to people who are athletically trained. Michael Tremblay was on the podcast and wrote an essay about Brazilian jiu-jitsu and stoicism and philosophical practice. We've had, Peter Sjöstedt wrote on psychedelics and philosophy. We've had people write about contemplation from the perspective of Zen Buddhism and Christian contemplation. And, we have people writing about philosophical practice, this kind of, Pierre Hadot inspired philosophy as a way of life, kind of injunction to live your philosophy in a transformative way. We've talked to cognitive scientists. I had Kevin Connolly on, I think, episode 17 or something, and he's doing all of this research in cognitive science on perceptual learning, and how literally our experience and our empirical investigation and our learning in the world is actually rewriting and reorganizing our physiology and the links between our cognition and our nervous system and our sensory system, so that what we're actually doing to ourselves through mastery of some task is actually changing the physiology of our perception, right? This is kind of Kevin Connolly's big point, is that we are not as experts or masters of a craft simply perceiving the sense data of the situation more or less the same way as other people, and then we have this sort of secondary cognitive layer that's assigning concepts or priorities or salience to that primary field of sensory data after the fact. No, what's actually happening is that our physical sensory systems are sort of level one sensory sensory awareness is actually being reshaped by practice, experience, and mastery. So that what we think of as that kind of cognitive second order layers is deeply implicated in, over time, over longer periods of time, implicated in the perceptual field. So I'm looking at this question in the broadest way that I can bring resources to bear on it. This question of the relationship between practices and perception, but it's not enough, I don't think, to just do it from multiple disciplines to get diverse interacting voices sort of complicating each other's images of this conversation, but also to do it from the standpoint of multiple media, right? So that's why I have the podcast, and that's why I'm trying to do video and audio, but also the journal. And hopefully, as we continue to open back up and get used to not just seeing each other, out in the world again, but um, hosting events, back to live events and things like that, and maybe doing more sort of community oriented things like Peter's doing with the Stoa. I know one next phase for him would be to figure out how to create a physical place, like a physical Stoa, um, a philosophical coffee shop, I think he calls it. Anyway, my point is, we're all trying to create something that's more than just the broadcast and communication of new ideas. I was just thinking through this recently in terms of the need for kind of apprenticeships, guilds, ways of not just broadcasting ideas, but um, creating communities of learning, new communities of learning that take advantage of the sort of productive capacity of print on demand, of podcasts, of group Zoom calls, and all of these kinds of things. Bringing that together in a kind of way that um, can lead to the next thing, right? Can lead to the next thing. Another person I think about a lot in this conversation is Johannes Niederhauser, who's started his own. It's a philosophical guild, the Thinkers Guild. He was on a few weeks ago. So there's a lot of these folks out there trying new things, and it's not like this has never been done before. It's not like people have never tried to create alternatives to existing institutions. But I think we're in a new phase of that process. And I think there are new opportunities opening up. And I think the way I've been kind of talking about it is that the 2010s were a big time for individual creators and sort of the broadcasting, new means of broadcasting ideas through, say, podcasts and YouTube videos. But you're still in that one to many kind of exchange. And there's not a lot of room for participation, and there's not a lot of room there for institution building and things that go beyond just individuals talking to crowds. And I don't mean that there weren't groups of people who were getting together in that time period and talking together with people. There's certainly sort of tribes running around on the internet doing that kind of thing. But bringing back a little bit more of a formal organizational and, to some extent, a hierarchical schema to those things for development is really where I see a lot of these things going, especially the side view, continuing on creating the podcast, continuing on with the journal, continuing doing online and print, all of these things, but expanding out into that more communitarian aspect, that more developmental aspect, something that seems more like a guild, at least the healthy aspects of what guild culture could bring us, apprenticeship culture and things like that. Um, and I really see Peter's Stoa as one of those places. I'd like to think of the side view as joining in that conversation as well. And yeah, I'm not going to say too much about the talk or the series because Peter does a great job kind of introducing all of that in his segment of this show, which is, like I said, the reposted episode. So I'm going to leave that in. The event I did with the Stoa is reproduced here, um, just wholesale. So as soon as I stop talking and get to the show, then you'll hear Peter's intro for the Stoa. You'll hear Peter introduce the event. It'll be Dave and I speaking, and then you'll hear us taking questions from the audience, just talking about the side view. But I wanted to use this introduction just to, one, explain what this episode is, but two, also to point you in the direction of the Stoa, to point you to what Peter Limberg is doing. He's written for the side view as well. I don't think I mentioned that in the beginning, but we have this kind of back and forth going. We have a few other things in the works that he and I have been talking about, just to kind of put a finer point in words on some of these transitions, on some of these evolutions, so that maybe those words can, um, if nothing else, just help us clarify to ourselves and the other people in our orbit what those next steps might look like, and then kind of use those as a means of rallying other folks in that direction, sharing our resources, sharing what works, sharing what doesn't, and yeah, just creating these. I don't know, for lack of a better word, you want to call them next generation multimedia um, education participation event sort of entities, organizations. And my hope is that we can continue to work together. Folks from the side view, folks from the Stoa kind of have a healthy relationship there. People who have written for the side view have spoken at the Stoa. People like Nora Bateson and Bonita Roy and many others have gone back and forth between our two organizations. So it feels like there's a real opportunity to yeah, just cross pollinate with other organizations and see where we can take this thing. So that's what this episode is. If you didn't hear it at the Stoa, I'm reposting it here because this will also be a, I think, very good introduction. Um, I received good feedback from the event from folks that I hadn't spoke to before, folks who weren't aware of the side view. I received good feedback that this was kind of a good introduction to the project, where it came from, where I came from, where it's going, etc. And so I think I'm leaving it here on the side view channel so I can link back to it here as well. And so folks who are more involved with the side view can also get that information and see it, but also so that we can direct some folks back over to Peter and create a bigger conversation. So I'm going to leave it there. Yeah, I hope you enjoy the show. I hope you enjoy Peter's work. And if you haven't, check out the links below for the Stoa. And yeah, new episode will be back next week.
All right, everyone. Welcome to the Stoa. Apologies, I got the time wrong, or there was a mistake in the Zoom invite. It said Pacific time when it was actually Eastern time. So those of you who are here managed to find their way. And this is the side view and the Stoa collaborating. I reached out to Adam, and Adam and I have been having ongoing discussions about how we can collaborate and how the Stoa and the side view can kind of do sessions and events and series together. And so this is the idea here is to have a series of at the Stoa, 4-part, 3-part series that Adam kind of organizes, and this is the first session of it, kind of the introducing the series, introducing the side view, and kind of finding the through line between both the Stoa and the side view. So the other sessions haven't been booked yet. They're in sort of in the works, but this session is going to be with Adam and David Collins. And I'll read the kind of the introduction to the description out loud for the people who are watching, because it's pretty sharp. So the side view shares with the Stoa 2 important beliefs. The first is that philosophy is a way of life, a practice of transformation rooted in new modes of perception, action, and virtue. The second is that philosophy, at least some of the time, should be pursued in public. In this series, Adam Robert will bring the side view to the Stoa and explore the nature of philosophical practice inside and outside the academy and the peril and promise of doing philosophy in the wild. Oof. I love that, philosophy in the wild. So how today is going to work, it's going to be around 60 to 90 minutes in total. Feel free to leave anytime you want. I'm going to tag in David in a moment, and David and Adam are going to have a conversation. I might jump in there at some point, and then we'll have a Q&A. So if you have any questions throughout this conversation, put your question in the chat. I'll call on you when we get to that portion, and then you can ask your question to David or Adam. So that being said, I will take in David.
Thanks, Peter. Hello, everybody. Very quick personal note. I'm in Austin, Texas. Had something of a milestone this afternoon when I replaced the ceramic lid on the tank of my toilet, no longer having to fill it by hand. I have water again and heat. It was 9 degrees here Monday a week ago. It's 79 at the moment. And I think I'm going to be okay, but with the different waters and food, my stomach's a little different. But I think we're good to go. I've contributed a few pieces to Adam's side view, online essays and a couple of journal articles. And my sense of what's going on there fits well with my own interest and orientation. I have a somewhat embarrassing amount of education, in part because I was interested throughout in those experiences that mean most to people in their lives. And I started in religious studies and was told after 2 master's degrees that I'd be better suited in a psychology program with my interest. And as I'm handing in my dissertation for a psychology doctorate, I'm told that my interest would be better suited in a religious studies program. My personal sense of what's going on with the side view matches up well with my understanding of, I'm getting just slightly academic here, the Augustinian sense of the will. For Augustine and the medievalists, the will was a movement of the heart. So having an embodied purpose is, in a way, a kind of love and or a resonance with beauty. I'm going to invite Adam to introduce his work, his vision, what it is the side view does, why it's called the side view. But I'm going to look to remind him and myself that all of this can be, and I think at the healthy core is, about a sort of beauty connected purpose. So rather than asking kind of conceptual oriented why questions, I'm going to look to ask what? What is going on? What does this mean to you? How is your heart coming to expression in your work? So a first question, Adam, what are you getting out of this work, and how is the work with the side view an expression of what things mean to you? What's going on for you with this work?
Yeah, that is the question, isn't it? What's going on for me with this work? There's a lot that's going on with this work. I think the main sort of drive is, there's a way that you could pursue the ideas that we're exploring with the side view by yourself. There's a way you could explore them through traditional means. I'm doing some of that myself, just through schooling and personal practice and things like that. But there's also, for me, a sense that right now, um, the sort of the main institutions and the main sort of mechanisms for distributing these, you know, very old, very time-tested ideas aren't really doing what they're supposed to be doing. And I was increasingly having these conversations with people where it became clear to me that what I thought of as, the core of philosophy, which in the way that I think about it also extends into things like science and art and various physical practices, wasn't really circulating at the level that it should be. And that we really had a problem on the one hand where our ability to disseminate these ideas was increasing, whilst at the same time, the institutions, especially the academic institutions, were becoming sort of less accessible. Ideas behind paywalls, increase in jargon, increase in sort of self-referential citation circles and things like that. And it just seemed like we needed to do better in getting those ideas out there. And there was a very obvious way to do that. And it was something like a kind of a new organization that's, mostly digital, but also exists in print, but doesn't just exist in print, doesn't just exist in words, it exists in conversation and in practice. And so that really was just the idea behind the side view. And, the name comes from kind of an offhand comment that this philosopher Peter Sloterdijk made in one of his books, where he said, "Look, we've done the history of philosophy in terms of the succession of ideas, but let's look at the people who created them. Let's look at the people who put them together, and let's not just look at the people. Let's look at how they became those people. Let's look at the practices of perception that let them um, give us the insights that they've given to us." And so he says, let's look at history from the side. Let's take a side view and watch them in their development as they became those people. And so I thought, aha, the side view. We're going to take a side view on all of these topics that people learn so much from, whether that's in psychology or design or science or athletics, philosophy, contemplation. Let's look at all of those things from the side, and let's kind of let people into the process of person formation that makes those things come alive for you in your own experience. In other words, they're not just intellectual ideas, but they're things that you can kind of assimilate, make part of your own life, transform your perception so that you are now one of those people for whom those things show up. And I realized that we could probably do that with some of the tools that we had laying around. The barrier to entry is very low. Probably what I'm doing right now probably wasn't possible 5 years ago, 10 years ago, probably certainly not. But it's really a very recent thing, being able to bring the ideas into material form and then actually spread them out throughout the world and connect with other people who are also doing that is like brand new. And so it's just astonishing to me that it wasn't already being done. And now it is. We have Peter with the Stoa. We have, all of these other organizations stepping up, kind of filling in for where I don't even know if we can fault the legacy institutions, because so much has changed in the past several years that I don't think anybody was really ready for or could predict. And yeah, I see it as we're living through something like the printing press moment, but in some ways it's way crazier and way weirder because it's multimedia, it's on the internet, the ability to multiply and reproduce an idea or a meme or whatever is just orders of magnitude greater than what the printing press allowed. And so here we are, and we need to make sense of it, and we need to participate in it because it's not going to unfold by itself.
So it's all, to my mind, my heart, really rich activity, rich material. I'm keying now on the phrase you used, the person formation, and feel free not to answer any questions that feel overly personal.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm interested in what of your person, what it is you care about, what it is that moves you, what it is you love is coming to expression and or is a motivation in your undertaking these activities. And the second, or the reciprocal side of that, how are these activities affecting your person?
Mm-hmm. Well, in a lot of ways, I feel like I'm starting backwards, in the sense that there was a period in my life brought on by um, various modes of exploration, psychedelic exploration, contemplative exploration, kind of venturing in and tinkering with things that I feel that in other contexts and in other eras would have involved spiritual direction, would have involved um, technique, skill, capacity, lineage, things like that, that wasn't there. And so those experiences still ended up shaping and forming and delivering insight, but I didn't know what to do with any of them. And so in some sense, I've been looking for language for over a decade to kind of try and tell myself a story that makes sense about what is the world, who am I, how does it all fit together, the philosophical questions of like coherence, what do we do, what do we do with science, what do we do with science with contemplative insight, what do we do with religion, what do we do with all of these things. And so a lot of it for me has been a kind of a search to contextualize, in some sense, my own past, right? And that's taken many different shapes and forms. Many of them I consider to be sort of dead ends, but in healthy empirical fashion, not always so healthy, but mostly healthy empirical fashion, the dead end still counts because it leads to another path. And so a lot of that has been kind of baked into the side view, where I'm looking for general language that can make sense of things intellectually and conceptually in a sort of a coherent and rational way, but that also isn't reductive. It's actually honest and faithful to the quality and character of some of these experiences. It treats the experiences on their own terms. And so that's why the project has ended up being quite interdisciplinary, because I found that the only way to get at whatever it is, the mystery, is through everything.
Yeah.
There's no one privileged road. And in fact, if you start to weight one of them too much, science, theory, body, intuition, intellect, too much, things start to get a little off. And you need to bring in some other source to rebalance the equation.
I'm fond of asking, I'm not going to ask this, but I'll bridge from it. This is a potentially obnoxious question, but usually it's well received. What's a best thing that happened to you today? The way I want to translate that here is, what's a best thing that's happening for you with this work?
You mean like literally today?
Well, you can go there, but
Yeah.
I was bridging to the side view work. What lovely or beautiful or meaningful, what's among the best things that are happening for you in this activity?
Yeah, it's unquestionably the community of people who have shown up around it to participate in the work, which was always part of the process, right? There's kind of two lanes that I'm operating in. One is, I'm still writing this dissertation, which is essentially the scholarly, from a disciplinary perspective, the scholarly philosophical version of the side view. And then there's the side view itself, which is this community of people connected through time and place, working through many different disciplines, some of them available in the academy, some of them not. But they're all getting at this question of the relationship between our practices and how we perceive, and how those practices get the world to show up in some way. And the best part about it is that I get to do this and have these conversations with people, several times a week. We're about to relaunch the podcast with video. I've just recorded 6 new episodes this morning. I was talking to Andrew McLuhan, who's the grandson of Marshall McLuhan, son of Eric McLuhan. He zoomed into my office here from his McLuhan Institute, in Canada. And we just talked, and we had a great conversation about his grandfather and his family and what that was like. And he was showing me annotations of Marshall McLuhan's books, literally showing them up to the camera. He said, here's his notes, here's what he wrote in these books. Yesterday, I was talking to a Jesuit scholar who just written a fantastic book on William Desmond and Charles Taylor and Pierre Hadot. And we just sat and chatted about that. And it's just, when you bring some of these ideas into kind of explicit conversation, at least for me, and I think the people who are a part of those conversations, there's an aliveness that starts to happen, and you start to feel light. I start to feel sort of unburdened of this kind of gnawing feeling that I often otherwise will carry around with me. And those conversations, they alleviate that, and they carry throughout the rest of the day and throughout the rest of the week. And when I have to then go and do stuff that, kind of is more the nuts and bolts of the week and paying the bills and stuff like that, like it has a different shine to it. Like it matters, because, oh, why am I doing this? Oh, because if I do this, then I get to go back to that. We get to unfold those ideas. We get to have those conversations, and we get to share them with people. And that's the best thing about this whole thing, easily, is bringing in that community aspect again. It's not the understanding we're looking for isn't inside one person's brain, right? I do think it's this kind of dialectical thing.
I'm reminded, I'm looking to teach myself now for several years running more about sort of the roots of the wisdom loving currents in our culture, philosophy, and realizing how much that really is a created word. That's to push it just a little, an artistic artifact. Plato kind of makes up that word as we have it now from him. But with Plato, I'm reminded with what you just said, how much of it is a dialogue. He's not writing out logic disquisitions. He's asking questions. He's having Socrates talk to Parmenides, and Parmenides say, "You don't know what you're talking about." And Socrates kind of agreeing when he's a young man. So that business of an interchange of where ideas are alive. They're things you interact with, play with, are played with by. And to ask a question, you don't have to answer, where do you see it going?
Well, you know, it
What I mean is
needs,
you don't have to know.
yeah, no, but I have
Uh-huh.
senses for what it is, and I have
Yeah.
senses for, like I said, in my view, we are losing in a lot of places, and for a lot of people, we're losing those institutional, academic, university spaces where these things are kind of supposed to happen. This is this is a kind of a charged and complicated topic, because I'm not saying it doesn't happen. I'm not saying that there aren't hundreds of university professors out there who are working for way less than they deserve, stuck in bureaucracy, stuck in a sort of business oriented model of how to disseminate education that often cuts against the nature of how these ideas want to come out and engage with other people. So I don't want to sound like I'm not aware that that isn't happening, and I don't want it to sound like a criticism of the professors themselves, but we are to some degree, I think, at risk of at least for a time, failing to transmit this kind of generational information. And I think if you look at the history of these kinds of ideas and practices, in some sense, you could make the claim that we're almost always at risk of losing some of these ideas. In other words, the channels by which they're transmitted intergenerationally are a little bit tenuous, are a little bit rare, happen on the fringes. They depend on a certain amount of luck and serendipity and patronage and things like that. You have to actually work to keep them going. Otherwise, you know, that light does go out. And so when I think about that, I think about, we need to think about, you know, there's things that the internet can do really well, like disseminate what people call content, which is, you know, this completely value neutral term that applies to, you know, what the Kardashians are doing just as much as it does what we're doing. You can put stuff out there, you can share it, you can circulate it very easily. But can you create learning communities, and can you create institutions, and can you create deeper multi-generational projects? And that's kind of where I'm looking at going. How do you do that? I love this another passage in one of same Peter Sloterdijk book, actually. It's called The Wisdom of Philosophy. He talks about Plato's Academy, and he asks sort of the question like, well, what is Plato's Academy? If you think about that in modern terms, you might think of a school with desks, right? But he's actually saying like, no, actually the Plato's Academy was more like what we would call like a retreat center. Like if you wanted to visualize it, it looks more like a monastery, or a place where you could go, you know, for a long weekend and sort of convalesce from the world. And that's very much how he's describing the relationship to ideas. It's like and where is the academy? It's not in town, right? It's a little bit. It takes a little bit time to get there. You have to leave the city, and it's away, and it's away on purpose because it's trying to create a little shell. And he likens the building itself to this other concept, epoche, right? Greek epoche. You might know this term from phenomenology. Edmund Husserl picks up this phrase too, but it's an older term which just means like suspension. Or I think of it as we were talking the other day of like an asceticism of the senses and thoughts and feelings and will and things like that. You're kind of letting go of the project of understanding what's happening so that something else can emerge, right? And he's saying that the academy is a building designed to afford that, right? And so I'm thinking about how can we get some of that into what we're doing online. These traditions of practice are sometimes associated with universities, and they have since, sort of the European medieval university system took hold, but historically they haven't always been. So there's not a necessary relationship there. So we could pick them up and do something else with them. And I think it starts with this slow process of getting your handholds in places where the barrier to entry is low. Like the lowest barrier to entry would be like sharing quotes on Twitter. there's like almost no barrier to entry. But then, writing, journals, online publications, podcasts, events, physical space, creating material objects. You see, there's like a whole like range of ways that these things can kind of materialize and come into the world. And so we're somewhere along that spectrum. We're like on the left-hand side where we're like barely have a presence in the physical world. Obviously, this is physical. Obviously, there are servers, there's technologies, but in the sense of like buildings and institutions, we're not that far along that process. And that's where I want it to go.
Say that again, where you want it to go?
Into the world of like multi-generational learning institutions.
It's a little bit of a tangent, but I'm forgetting where I saw it just recently, especially in early Greece, while you had temples and you had festivals, you didn't so much have church congregations. The closest thing to that were the philosophy schools.
Mm-hmm.
They're organized. They have a sense of conscience, what behaviors are appropriate. Does it come up for you at all to ask whether what you're doing is a religious activity?
It does. And I don't know what to make of the question, really. I can tell you that it's to some degree, the side view is in the sense of like, in the modern sense of the word, a liberal space, and to some degree, a neutral space. It's certainly a pluralistic space, but it's not a secular space. Secular could be one of the things that it does, but it can't be the ground of it. Because the ground of it transcends that secular religious divide. And I feel the same way about my own life, and maybe that's reflected in the organization of the side view. I didn't grow up with any kind of religious background. Nobody in my family is particularly religious. I didn't have either those, sort of positive developmental experiences that people have growing up in a church, say, but I also don't have a negative charge. Talked to a lot of people who one of the core themes in their life is trying to figure out what to do with the trauma of their religious upbringing. And I say that because there's an attempt right now in these spaces, in spaces that are aligned with the side view or close by or have nothing to do with it, but are kind of exploring what's the role of like mindfulness practice, right? This is something you've thought a lot about too, Dave. To what extent can we rethink mindfulness in the terms of like psychological and medical health? And so you can turn it into this kind of pragmatic thing where, well, we don't really understand the
Right.
roots of these things in revelation and religious tradition and things like that, but it does seem to like lower people's blood pressure, does seem to have a, it helps with anxiety and ADD maybe. um, that I'm interested in steering away from that and kind of looking back at the question of realism, especially as it has to do with the question of religion and theology in that sense. But there's a real tension there. One of the things that I love about Plato as a model for these kinds of things is that in the dialogues you get sort of, you know, extremely rigorous, logical, discursive reasoning, conceptual analysis, linguistic analysis, right? Questions about the status of morals, how to identify universals or not, do universals exist? Most of the questions that people associate with postmodernism and pluralism and skepticism are in the dialogues already. And, probably some of the best responses are also there. There's also this whole question, so that's there, right? Reason, discursive analysis, conceptual analysis, language. But there's also this other side that, people refer to as the oral tradition or the unwritten doctrines, where you get, what you were gesturing towards, David, which is theoria, where we get our word theory from, which is something like beholding a beatific vision, or participating in these festival rites where the purpose is to witness something transformative. Other people have ventured that these events involve psychedelic substances. I think you can be agnostic on whether or not that's true. I think it probably is true. You don't have to take that on board to appreciate what I'm saying, because there's still that component of the aesthetic vision having this transformative capacity that's then kind of bounced back and forth with the dialectical reasoning that you find in the written dialogues. And so if we want to take on this question of religion and what it means, or maybe even myth, maybe even things like the unconscious in a Jungian sense, you need a different set of skills to understand what's going on there, while you hold on to the value of reason and checking it against reason. And I think that's what you get in a lot of these, in the sort of Socratic tradition, is those experiences in tandem with reason. So you get reason and faith, or something like that. That old question of the relationship between the two. So that's I'm wrestling with the question of how do we think that today in the context of the side view, but also these larger conversations.
So, as you and I have talked some in other formats, religion, of course, the word has a history. Early on with the Latins, it meant superstition. Etymologically, it means reconnection. In Socrates' time, Plato's time, there wasn't a word that matches up with our word religion. There were practices, and typically they were communal practices. And part of Socrates' issue and problem was that he had his own structure questioning way of being in the world, which got in some people's understanding in conflict with custom, with the way it had always been done. But as you're speaking, I'm again reminded of how unfortunate it is, how impoverished in many ways our modernist construction of what religion is, and how it is and so often set in opposition to scientific reasoning. Some of the scientists are notorious for making very unscientific pronouncements about what religion is. They don't know what they're talking about. At the same time, there's a reasonable distinction to be made between a dogmatic, mind-closing belief system and an explorative, heart-opening faith, openness.
Mm-hmm.
And so you can go anywhere you want with this comment, but I'm reminded of two things. One, how impoverished our conceptualizations of religion in our day tend to be, and how, I'll use this word, spiritual I sense much of your engagement to be with the sort of explorations you're undertaking and expressing through the work in the side view.
Yeah, I mean, I think we can get at that comment in two different ways. Um, what you already gestured at, and that's not true, is that uh, science as labeled is a non-dogmatic, honest, empirical investigation of the world, and religion is a fundamentalist, unthinking following of rules laid down by dead people. This is totally not true in any real sense. But so what is true is the interesting question. What's the way to think about that? And I think I shared this quote from a man, his name's P.T. Forsyth, who's quoted in the introduction to Thomas Merton's book on contemplative prayer, which is short and excellent if anybody's interested in Thomas Merton's work. He said, prayer is to religion as empirical investigation is to science. Which is really confusing, I think, if you have this image of prayer as you sitting down and asking for things
Right.
from a big guy who looks like Santa Claus and sits in the sky. And if you follow his rules, he'll reward you with stuff. It's a form of investigation, prayer is. It's a form of investigating that requires a transformation in your own self in order to understand certain things. And so there are, you could call them access conditions, maybe. A more formal way of talking about that would be to say that epistemology is not adequately described as the correspondence theory of truth, in the sense that you are trying to form a correct mental representation that stands in for a physical object in the external world, and that all you have to do is get the right image to link up with the right thing, and that's what knowledge is. This image is deeper. This image suggests that the type of things that can even show up for you in experience to be represented depend on who you are. So this is where the sort of person forming side of the project comes back in. The whole person sees, the whole person perceives. The eyes don't see, the thinking isn't something that happens inside your brain. Thinking is something that David does. Thinking is something that David does with his whole body in his environment. And how you transform yourself and the practices that you engage in have a lot to say with what you're able to encounter. And so it's not static world, static self, let's get the representation right. It's like participation, right? This is old Platonic idea. You're in the middle of the thing that you're trying to represent. You're somehow an expression of it. You're not a subject standing against an object in that sense. There's that sort of non-dual thing, to use that kind of language, happening. And your thoughts, feelings, wills, practices, bodies have a lot to do with what's going on epistemologically. And so that's where the practices come back in. And that makes those practices that fall in the lane of what we think of as religious or spiritual or contemplative, they're actually a lot more like the practices that today we call scientific and empirical. They're actually all kind of very similar, which is why this kind of perspective, the side view has it's kind of a meta perspective, but not really. It's a side perspective. It's why it works in all of those different domains, though, because the criteria for success, if you want to put it that way, are very similar.
I think, well, there's a lot of richness in what you just said. I'm keying now on the word works. As a religionist, cross-cultural interest in parallels in contemplative practices, I'm continually put back on, as you just said, a sort of empiricism, a going and looking, a practical, experiential, eye-opened honesty as the healthy heart of those traditions, the contemplative traditions most exemplarily. And how much it makes sense to ask not, do I believe this or do I not believe this? Do I accept this? But to ask very matter-of-factly, how does this work?
Mm-hmm.
What are the experiential operations at play here?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I think that leads back into the participatory dimension that I was gesturing towards, because there is something there to participate with.
And my sense, not to cut you off, but I've not read Sloterdijk, but my sense of the spirit of the side view, asking, how did we get here? How is this constructed? What is this a flowering of? Is akin to asking, how does this work? Not so much, do I believe it, do I reject it?
Yeah, I think so. How does it work, and what happens when I do it, I think, is the other part. You know?
Yeah.
What happens when I do it? And this is the twist on epistemology. What happens when I do it earnestly and faithfully and honestly?
Yeah.
So epistemology isn't relativistic necessarily, but it is state dependent, if that makes sense.
It totally does. And we're coming to a time when I invite you to say anything more you want to add, and then maybe invite others to contribute. It's rather dry and awkward on my part, but what you just said remind me, not only are sometimes why questions overly intellectual generating, but even asking sometimes what, that can be more explorative, more empirical. But you remind me just now how often it's healthy to approach this sort of adverbially. How am I engaging with these materials? How am I being affected?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Adam.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks, Dave. Yeah. Should we open it up? Peter, do you have any thoughts on whatever we just said?
Yeah, I'll share some thoughts. If you have any questions, start throwing them in the chat. We'll be here for maybe 30 more minutes, and then we'll close out. Yeah. So I guess two things came to mind, and I'll share one. So I took philosophy at the University of Toronto. It was like, meh, whatever. It was good. But I only kind of discovered what philosophy was like, what, maybe 5 years afterwards, like being in a philosophical practice with Andrew Taggart. He's, you know who Andrew Taggart is. He's a philosophical counselor, and he was influenced by Pierre Hadot. It was so weird going to that session with him. I didn't know, like, what were we doing? But we philosophized together, but it was about me, the contents of my life, what was most existentially salient. And before that, I thought philosophy was just even though I took it, I liked it, I geeked out about it, but there was like a masturbatory quality. There was something that was just totally not practical about it. And there was like that narcissistic signaling about how interesting I am. I'm philosophizing. But after engaging with Andrew, it was like intertwined with my life philosophy now. I couldn't separate the two. And I really felt I understood the meaning of what it meant to philosophize with someone else. Because I was at the edge always in conversation with him. So yeah, I have another question, but I guess I'll just pause there. What do you think about that? Like philosophizing with in such a way that it's so intertwined with the personal.
Yeah, I mean that is in some sense the essence of the practice, at least at like a first pass, I would say. A lot of those practices, I would say that phrase "know thyself" is related to what you're saying. But then I think as you kind of dig into that question, that topic gets increasingly strange in some sense, and moves you. It's not like the personal level of it disappears, but it's also not where the thing kind of bottoms out. You know, it goes beyond. You'll end up beyond your personal biography, so to say, and you'll end up recontextualizing that biography in terms of this other thing. But the other thing that I hear you saying is what happened what happened in the philosophy class that you took, and why did it not connect you with this kind of thing? And this is one of the sessions that we're planning, that Peter and I have discussed, what to do with that question. And I pointed to it a little bit earlier, just in terms of the university system today. And we're gonna do another panel on Pierre Hadot has written a paper. It's actually a quote from Henry David Thoreau, and the paper is just called "There are nowadays professors of philosophy, but not philosophers."
Mm-hmm.
And he has a historical explanation for what went on there that we'll probably explore in that session. But there is definitely that sense that there's something missing, and that things aren't going as they're supposed to in many philosophy classes. And I think that's all true. And I also want to say that there's probably a lot of good philosophy actually happening in places that you wouldn't expect it, and in environments that don't seem conducive to it. So we're going to get a panel together, and I want to explore that question from multiple different angles, hopefully bring in some working university professors and just let them also speak to it from their perspective. What's happening? What are their experiences like? I mentioned this fellow, the Jesuit Ryan Duns, that I interviewed yesterday. He's doing amazing stuff, teaching contemplation in class and doing all kinds of different exercises with his students. So stuff like that is happening, but there's also this kind of in analytic and continental philosophy, a lot of stuff going on that's manifestly not what we're talking about. So it's worth thinking about why.
I'll tag here, calling back the early part of the conversation, emphasizing kind of the joy, the worth, the wonder of being in community, connecting with others. And I'm reminded of it with what Peter just shared, going from a sterile-ish classroom disquisition to a lived encounter with another human being to talk about this stuff. That a strong frame for the Greek "know thyself" was the understanding that knowing yourself meant knowing your connections with your community, nature, the divine, knowing your place in a uplifting sort of affirming way.
Mm-hmm.
So,
and
yeah, go ahead.
just one quick thought, Peter, that the other phrase that sounds like kind of what you were doing in your philosophical dialogues that isn't signal boosted as much as know thyself is care for thyself. And that was also very much present in the Socratic tradition and beyond. Knowing and caring, knowing as a kind of caring as a kind of knowing. And in some sense, I think the know thyself has kind of dominated to such an extent that it needs that complement from the care, but philosophical care, right?
Mm-hmm. So the other question I had, and the first question I had, and the one I'm going to ask right now, they're both sort of in service of I don't know, making philosophy more accessible, but this idea of philosophizing in the wild, that was the most salient thing that caught my attention in the bio.
Yeah.
And you and I were going to write about the Stoa before the Stoa even started. Like conceptually, like what is the Stoa? It's not the academy. Like the original Stoa, Bokele, it was a place where people sold stuff, artists came to entertain, they had public announcements, and a bunch of philosophers were hanging out on the porch, and then like, hey, look, and then they got the name the Stoics. But it wasn't a place to philosophize. It was just like a public space where philosophers came to gather. And so the way I hold the Stoa, it's not a place to talk about Stoicism. It's just a place to come and then like to philosophize in the wild, to talk about what's most important. And so I like this. And then this kind of this question, Benita just put something in the chat that's similar to this, is the barriers to entry. How much like academic philosophy, historical philosophy do we have to read? How much kind of the nuts and bolts of dialectic do we need to know in order to philosophize together? So yeah, I guess the twofold question there is what kind of container is needed, the minimum viable container to philosophize together, and what are the barriers of entry?
Yeah. Well, I mean, if you read, I think of our situation as more like the Greek situation, especially here in the Stoa. But what we're moving into in the coming years looks more like the Greek situation, maybe the Renaissance, maybe the medieval period, more than it has the modern period. By which I mean that you'll get more privately held schools and activities, things upheld by patronage, um, distributed school systems and guilds and apprenticeships and that kind of thing. What you're describing, the Stoa, just a public space for gathering. It's going to look more like that than kind of the centralized um, university system that we've had for maybe the past 120 years or so. But so that's exciting and that's cool. But if you read the dialogues, there's tremendous concern over sophistry and rhetoric and opinion and manipulation and politicians and other actors who don't have the public good in mind. And so why are they talking about that? They're talking about that because those things are really at risk. And that's kind of our moment as well. And it's probably always there to some degree, but it's there for us in a particularly strong way because we have tremendous opportunity to go out and share these ideas and have these conversations like we're doing now, but so does everybody else. And I'm not saying that we're, doing it the best and that there's nothing that we couldn't improve on, but there's a huge amount of noise out there. And there's a huge amount of people who don't really know what they're talking about, to be honest. So this is kind of going into, do we need to read the great works of philosophy? I don't think, to live philosophically, I think the answer is no. But the reason that I like to reach for athletic metaphors is because we seem to be able to observe those and pick them up more readily than we do some of the more theoretical or contemplative exercises. They're harder to visualize in conversation. So my analogy would be kind of answering Benita's question. Do you need to read the great philosophers? I think to some extent you do need to have an engagement with tradition for the same reason that, say, today, you wanted to start a martial arts school that's specialized in grappling. And you thought, I don't need to study any jujitsu. I don't need to study any wrestling. I'm just going to figure this out for myself. Even if you were extremely talented, extremely athletic, you're going to come up against people who are leveraging the memory of intergenerational learning, who have already explored the territory and figured out how to do certain things and can teach you how to do certain things. And so you don't need to go to this or that school, but there are schools that transmit this knowledge better than others. And that involves engaging with the books and the traditions. So I kind of think about it like that.
There are, of course, interrogations, especially in contemplative currents, about the place of conceptual learning and the emphasis on an experiential ascesis, a practice. Zen is fairly notorious and hyperbolic around it. Talks of throwing away their scriptures. Matter of fact, most of them had already memorized the scriptures, so they could dispense with them. But the spirit that there are a number of ways, and that's part of what I sense in what's happening with the side view. Different folks with different trajectories, different modalities, different voices, collecting mushrooms, folks looking to engage with their lives. Some of it's through philosophic structures, but others very much is just activities, asking questions, and just in the Buddhist image, touching the earth, getting in connected with what is most simply of meaning and vitality for us.
Benita, do you have anything you'd like to add to that? Because we kind of riffed off your question.
Yeah, no, for me, it's an interesting question because, I've been teaching the master's level for a long time, and every year I'm in this inquiry of like, people don't read anymore. First of all, you kind of have to. I teach adults who aren't necessarily bright intellectuals that are pursuing a PhD, and I'm always teetering between like, we do have very robust resource lists, but nobody reads anymore. It's just true, and so I'm in this dance where you're trying to create an insight or a shift in perception, but you can't. So it's more like pointing out practices, but there's a sense of even the brightest people, they don't really read some of the essential pieces. And if they spent some time reading the essential pieces, they would know a whole lot about, for example, how the mind works, what's the structure of thought, what's the structure of reasoning. But then there's a reality, I mean, there's a reality. So it's a kind of, and I've had to let go of that part of me that's like, barks at them because they need to read but I think that if I agree with you, I think that when you read a great philosopher, you can read for content, but if you're reading to adopt their mode of thinking, then your mind becomes much more flexible, and you can do different things with your mind. And also my question was, I have to admit, was, I came into this, I was watching the recording of the Daniel Ingram, Frank Yang podcast session. And all I could think of was they need to read some really good Western thinkers,
Mm-hmm.
because whenever you hear someone explaining the recursivity of experience, like it's nature, it's the universe talking to itself, right? That's the nature of mind. That, so like there's so many, the Western philosophers, the Western contemporary thinkers like Evan Thompson, I don't know if you saw, there's so much rigor in some of this work that is, yeah, that, and of course it's really sad because people like yourself and there are people writing amazing, there's living Platos, and they don't make money and they don't get traction and they don't have a lot, 10 million likes. And yeah, I kind of think that's sad. I don't know what to do about it because, as I said, I find myself retreating every year and trying to find more popular versions of some of this, but we're certainly not training minds, like you said. We don't have like a lot of mind dojos.
I I have this intuition that a lot of what you just said, I know, I obviously know some of the history as well, so it's not just my sense, but I think it's kind of always been that way. I don't think that, I mean, there are exceptions of, well placed people also being famous philosophers or things like that, but a lot of it is, I mean, historically, I think it's mostly been either patronage from wealthy people who did something completely different that wasn't philosophical, or you were attached to some giant bureaucracy like the university system or the church system, and you could work within those confines. But I think the nature of the thing is that it doesn't get a million likes. I don't think it's that kind of thing, and I think um, you have to keep it alive. But I don't think there's ever been a point in history where it was like this. I think it's always been a little bit esoteric, a little bit hard to understand, fewer people involved, that kind of thing. And I just have this sense, Benita, that 2,500 years ago there was the equivalent of you teaching students going, oh my God, these, they can't focus. They're so distractible. They can't. I think some of these things are just perennial issues, maybe.
I'm fond, I've used it in other talks, how in Middle English, the way you spelled the word concept was Conceit, that we're forever in danger of the naming fallacy, whereby we presume we know something because we've got a name for it, a concept for it, a mental model of it. In archaic language is idolatry. So like the Grateful Dead, I feel I need a miracle every day. Or a buddy of mine who's a Presbyterian minister, he feels that a conversion experience is called for every day. Taking the side view, how does this arrived at story, image, postulate work? What is it? How does it come from? And it's overgeneral on my part, but as a religionist, I'm fond of suggesting that if we take religious language literally, we're not taking it seriously enough, that it behooves us to approach it as an art form, as a poetry, expressive of an experience and gesturing towards potential experience.
All right. Let's sneak into a few more questions. We got our resilient lifestyle designer at the Stoa, Jacob Lund Fisker. If you'd like to ask your question, Jacob.
Right, I think the sound is on. So like in high finance, the world has essentially split into academics and practitioners in a way where each have developed very, very different worldviews. I mean, it's technically, you have the teachers and the doers, and those two are almost, in my experience, completely siloed, as in like they don't talk to each other, they don't understand each other. Do you see something similar happening in philosophy, or do you see a risk of it happening, and would that be a good thing or a bad thing?
Yeah, I think that's definitely the case. I think there's a big split, and it has to do, I think, with disciplinary specialization as well, where if you want to construe philosophy in something like Plato's sense, you're actually doing today what would be split across philosophy, spirituality, religion, and psychology. And then if you want to do like in Aristotle's sense, but metaphysics, physics and metaphysics, and you're also doing some of the natural sciences. And so philosophy in this sense has to kind of include all of them. And when you're just down to philosophy in kind of its disciplinary university sense, in a lot of places, it ends up being about learning texts. You end up being a professor of philosophy rather than a philosopher. It's something that you do when you walk in as part of your paycheck, and then the rest of your life is kind of separated off, and you live however you live, you know. Whereas, you know, the older model would have been something more like on the basis of a religion. You know, I don't think religious people think of themselves that way. It's more of a whole way of life, a whole way of being. That's really the kind of the conception of philosophy that we'd be looking at. And I think that, yeah, there's a big split there, but it's not just academic, not academic, practical, not practical. It's kind of a result of this sort of disciplinary specialization where, like I was saying, there's knowledge and there's care. Well, we outsourced care kind of to psychology and therapy, but really that's should be part of philosophy as well. So I just see proliferation of silos everywhere, and we need some kind of reintegration of those different fields.
Any comment, David?
I guess my question in terms of reintegration is like, who would take the first step, the practitioner side or the other side? Insofar that's possible. Like, how would it happen?
Well, so we're trying to launch a project. One of the next, we do kind of themes for the journals. One of the themes that we're going to explore this year is this figure of the scholar practitioner, which would be a way of kind of bridging that gap in one way. I've had this experience, especially in the Bay Area. There's a lot of mindfulness communities, Buddhism, meditation centers, places that you can go and have, you know, an hour-long sit and just kind of have a guided meditation with a teacher. Those spaces, in my experience, aren't super interested in having intellectual discourse or dialectical kind of exchanges. And then in the universities, you get kind of the reverse, where you have scholarship, but not practice. Or, you know, we have yoga, we have martial arts, we have, you know, every kind of physical activity you could think of, also separated from those other two. So you kind of go and do one thing separately here and there. So one way to bring them together, we're going to try and do this thing of like scholar practitioners. There's very few people who do that kind of stuff. And Benita mentioned Evan Thompson. He's one of those people who's doing like really high level scholarship on history and philosophy, contemplative practice, and is also a practitioner. So what does it look like if we try to kind of normalize that a little bit more? And I think for me, Socrates is something like that. You know, he's not part of like a degree granting institution in the way that we think of, but he's doing the scholarly work, and he's also an ascetic. You know, Socrates is a kind of an ascetic man. David wrote a nice article called "The Contemplatives." Socrates, he's a contemplative guy. So bringing it together in that way, the scholarship and the practice, I think we can do that.
Awesome. Thank you, Jacob. We'll take in Evan.
So this question is sort of exploring some similar lines as you've been speaking of the past few minutes. So I was really intrigued by the title of the event, Attention as an Art Form. And so if we think of the ways of being and knowing and doing that are suggested, if we take this statement as true, they seem almost entirely absent from academia in its modern incarnation. We seem as a culture to spend so much time, money, energy on this forms of education that is essentially almost entirely propositional in nature, and which doesn't take into account even the simple existence of this art of attention, or if the art of attention is noticed, it's expected that students pick up this art somehow on their own. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts specifically about engaging with academia as a set of institutions which have so systematically undervalued the art of attention, at least in recent history, past couple hundred years at least, and specifically the sort of dynamics of moral hazard, because academia has a hegemony over the notion of education in our culture, at least as popularly construed. And so are we, in some sense, if we engage with academia, get degrees granted from these institutions, teach at these institutions, are we placing ourselves in a position of moral hazard where we're actually sort of using our voice to prop up the legitimacy of these institutions as having hegemony on the concept of education? So any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like this is the same set of topics that we've been orbiting around. And I think it's a complex thing, and this is why I hedged so much when I started talking about universities in general, because there's a lot of conversation online today about ideological capture in universities, bureaucratic capture, financial capture, um, the falling value of degrees, lack of support for the humanities, things like this. There's all this, there's like giant machines working to kind of, pick these sort of sacred traditions apart. And so we want to be conscious of that. And the question I ask is, are we better off with or without the universities? And I think the answer is we are undoubtedly better with them, in spite of all of their flaws. And I feel that way in some sense about various media organizations and stuff, as well as captured and ideological as they can be. But so the question is, where is this stuff happening? And I think I had the same question for Pierre Hadot when I read his work, because he basically said, at some point in the medieval European university system, the church basically captured higher education. And a lot of philosophy and science, in his telling, became the handmaiden of Christian theology. In other words, the driving force of education was to justify certain metaphysical notions about Christianity in the face of increasingly, to them, very bizarre empirical insights about the nature of the universe, right? But so it was kind of an ideological capture in a different direction. And he says at that point, it stopped becoming a way of life proper, and it became a way of justifying sort of a regime. I don't think that story really holds up in a lot of ways, but you kind of get the picture. And he says that that's when it kind of became this bureaucratic professorship, and not the earlier sort of model of like, living spiritual philosophers with all these, authentic exercises and so on. Then he goes on to list all of these places where philosophy as a way of life was still being practiced. And he lists, like, well, most of the major figures of philosophy from, the 1500s to now. And so I'm kind of going, wait a minute, you're saying this doesn't exist, but all the main figures in our philosophical history are examples of the right way to do philosophy. That seems inconsistent. And I think we're in the same position today, where there's this kind of aggregate image that kind of matches what Benita's saying, maybe, and a lot of people are having that experience. And there probably is a lot of real transformation happening, in the academy, and even in places where it doesn't seem like it is happening at all. And so I'm always having a question to myself of, to what degree am I trying to transmit something that's been lost, and to what degree am I just kind of giving words to something that's still happening but is just often implicit. And I think it's a little bit of both. I think some of it is being lost, and I think some of it just is implicit. And so even if you are only doing this layer of like propositional understanding and, making arguments and syllogisms and stuff, that's still a kind of mind training. That's still a kind of attention. And that's certainly feeding back into your way of being and perception in the world. It may not be the most sort of full-fledged expression of it, but it's there, and I think right now we need to support those efforts, even in those spaces. Because I think, in my opinion, we really need as much of it as we can get. We're not suffering from an overly intellectual, overly propositional society in general, if you understand what I'm saying. So to some degree, I think it's important to take what we have and then also expand on it and include all of these other facets that have either gone missing or have retreated into these other areas, like I was saying, like the meditation centers, the sort of the more embodied practices, the aesthetics. Aesthetics has a huge role to play in all of this. David was talking about how, language is in some sense a poetic kind of creation, but poetry in a sense of disclosing something about being, right? It's not art and poetry as sort of subjective positing of an otherwise neutral universe. It's art as also kind of accessing regions of being in other ways. And so I think we need to we have all these pieces. We just need to bring them together in a different way.
I'm reminded by Evan's question of the way in which mindfulness is getting engaged with in our culture. There's an explosion of studies and clinical applications, but there's a kind of backroom question. Is this psychology? Is this medical neurology? Is this religion? Long story short, I've got an essay on this on the side view, but I'm a mindfulness teacher, and I worked as a training clinic manager at the university here in Texas, Austin, for 16 years. Just took early retirement. In that 16 years, I was regularly asked to speak to the psychology department, and particularly to positive psychology classes on, for lack of a better word, mindfulness. I was also asked by the sociology department. I was asked by the social work folks. I was asked by the business school to come and teach mindfulness. I was never asked by the religion department to speak. There's still that sort of mindset among many religion departments that they have to be somehow scientific and not ask about what this really means to people. We have to study history and linguistic analyses and historical influences. But as far as lived meaning, it's still, that part of academia has got a ways to go to catch up to what it can be learning.
All right. So we're going to close out here because it's almost at the bottom of the hour. But I'll take in Adam and David just for any closing thoughts. And maybe, Adam, you can kind of set up a potential next session that we have here at the Stoa.
Sure. Yeah. So the next session is going to be a roundtable TBD about this Pierre Hadot paper. We're going to explore this question. Why are there so many philosophy professors and so few philosophers? And is that a fair way of framing the conversation? Getting more into that and what to do about it and what we can do in these kind of, parallel emergent spaces to kind of move that along. That's going to be the next in the series. If you haven't checked out the website is just thesideview.co. We have 3 journal issues printed, I think maybe 40, close to 40 articles. We're doing podcasts. The YouTube channel is about to launch this week or next. I'm just kind of on hold with the video with a friend of mine who's doing a little post-production. So as soon as those are ready, there'll be a video channel, more podcasts. But really, I want to get involved, other people involved, everybody from the Stoa involved. I think we have these 2 kind of parallel organizations that work very well together, and that we're doing something here that hasn't really happened before. And we should be taking advantage of it and thinking consciously about how to evolve it forward. And so, yeah, reach out to me, reach out to David. David's been a part of this since, we started. Yeah, let's talk. How to follow up and, collaborate on things with everybody here.
The reference to positive psychology reminds me of how far they have to go to catch up with the world's philosophers and contemplatives, but it's got a healthy spirit to it. And among the things they're attending to or realizing is how helpful it can be to connect with what you're grateful for. One exercise is to write a gratitude letter to someone, even if you never send it. And on that overlong setup, I'll say, I'm grateful to Peter and Adam here for the work you're doing, and to everybody who's participated tonight. Several times, the emphasis on community, on sharing experience of dialoguing with one another, of kind of heart-to-heart encounters. What else are we here for? And I'm grateful to y'all for this.
Yeah, likewise.
Beautiful.
Thank you, Peter, for the space.
Gratitude well received, my friends. Yeah, I highly recommend check out the Side View. It's probably the best para-academic outlet out there. Especially check out the 3rd edition, I have an article in it with Bonita, I think, which is quite an honor for me. So yeah, before I make some closing announcements, thank you, my friends, Adam and David, for coming to the Stoa. Looking forward to the other sessions in the series. I'll plug one event, the Pneuma of the Stoa, Why Breathwork Will Save the World, with a bunch of Wim Hof. So I'm a little bit of a sophist when it comes to event titles, I confess, but it's a good skill set to have. That's 7 p.m. Eastern time. All of these Wim Hof trainers are going to come in and do some breathwork at the Stoa, so that should be quite fun. All right, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to
Thanks,
Stoa.
everybody.